I just want to put in one more point about why GDP sucks so badly, excuse my language. And that's because it's not just all the various excellent things that have already been said by Stewart and Jason and Kate and everyone, but it's also because, it has given rise to this peculiar notion of productivity, which is GDP per worker, which is completely meaningless and which is constantly used and rammed down in terms of somehow defining the activities that are economically superior and more desirable, which are defined entirely in terms of the so-called value they create, that is the price they can charge. And the lower the labor force you use, the better the productivity. This has had terrible implications for devaluing the care economy, of course, which you know all about, but it also devalues many other things, and it completely wrongly values a lot of very, very harmful activities, whether it is finance or a whole range of other things. So I think we need to recognize that the fact that productivity measures implicitly are given some kind of ascriptive value and some kind of perception that these are superior. I think that's very, very important, that we get rid of the GDP simply to get rid of those productivity measures. The second point I want to raise, so okay, I'm really going to talk about the international, and I have to say I was drooling with envy when I was hearing Kate and all of the wonderful things that are going on in Europe, because we would love to have our donuts too. At the moment, certainly in India, it seems politically very far away, but it's not just because it's politically far away. It's because most developing countries cannot do the donuts. And it's not only because the domestic politics impedes it, it's because the global economic relations and the global architecture impede it. So my appeal really would be, and I know you have a very tough time anyway in the parliament, okay, but my appeal would be if you can somehow raise these issues in the parliament, that you cannot actually get any kind of deal functioning and sustainable and over time if it is not global. But that global requires a greater responsibility in a whole range of other things that, at least so far, haven't come up in this particular conversation. So I think first, and this is something Kate alluded to, the first point is about consumption. So, and I think Jason also alluded to it. It's not just the patterns of production. It's very much about consumption. And so far, what we've observed is that the countries in the north that have managed to get better and better in terms of the emissions and so on, have exported the problem because they are importing a lot of the stuff that is produced in the south with very carbon emitting and very unsustainable and very deforesting kinds of production techniques. So I think you really have to have a target for green consumption rather than just the production processes. And Kate talked about this, but she talked about it in the context of a city. And I think it's important to recognize that it's really advanced economies as a whole, and these are macro policies. Okay, the big point of concern for me right now is that, in fact, as we speak, things are getting significantly worse in terms of greening in most of the developing world. We are getting in the wake of the pandemic, and because governments are so desperate to generate GDP or some kind of economic activity at any cost, because they've had lockdowns, they've got disease, they don't know how to deal with it. So they are out there doing what they can in terms of deforestation, in terms of encouraging all kinds of environmentally disastrous new investments that will be much more polluting, fossil fuel investments. Every coal-producing country I can think of has actually dramatically increased investment in coal in the last 2 months, and so on. I mean, I could go on and on. But so what we're seeing is actually a significant worsening of the situation. And this is happening also because of foreign policy and foreign economic policy of the North. So if I could just give the UK example, it's the trade patterns, of course, the kinds of things you import and the terms on which you import it, and the way you pressurize the others to actually race to the bottom in that respect. The aid patterns, which have actively encouraged certain kinds of production and investment. The trade agreements or the economic partnership agreements. At the moment, there's one being negotiated with the UK and India, which will be disastrous for any kind of greening of the Indian economy. The debt contracts, the sovereign debt contracts, 90% of all debt contracts in the world are negotiated in New York and London. I think the City of London alone has about 40% of the debt contracts. And most of them at the moment are unsustainable. But UK law has been used in a very perverse way to actually prevent the possibility of decent sovereign debt restructuring. So there really needs to be some pressure to enable UK law to be a little bit more forgiving of international debtors in the same way that it is a little bit more forgiving of domestic debtors. It's not very forgiving, but it's better for domestic debtors than it is for international. So that would be if I like. So what I'm really saying is that, you know, if we have to have a new deal, it would have to be global. It will not be sustainable otherwise. But I would argue that it has to be multicolored. Green for sure, but blue because water is a massive problem. The desertification of many of our countries, China, India, large parts of Africa, but also the lack of access to clean water. So blue. It has to be purple for the care economy, and you've had many sessions on that, so you know more about it now than I do. And it has to be red for being egalitarian. So, but all of that means that you have to be conscious, I would say, of the role of the UK in the global economy and the extent to which many of the UK's current policies, I'm not even talking about ecological debt and all of that, right now, the things that are going on are making things so much more difficult for developing countries to actually do any of those things.